Hello and welcome to the Occupied Thoughts podcast. I'm Peter Beinart, a non-resident fellow with the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is July 22nd, 2021. I'm delighted to be joined today by my friend and colleague, Lara Friedman. Lara is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. With more than 25 years working in the Middle East foreign policy arena, Lara is a leading authority on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, with particular expertise on the Israeli-Arab conflict, Israeli settlements, Jerusalem, and the role of the U.S. Congress. And particularly relevant for today, for years, Lara has been researching and documenting ongoing Israel-Palestine related lawfare efforts. In other words, efforts to exploit U.S. laws, both state and federal, and courts to quash criticism and activism challenging Israeli policies to delegitimize Palestinian organizations and the Palestinian cause. And I think in that regard, there's something which is very topical this week that Lara is the perfect person to talk to, and that is the decision by Ben & Jerry's, or I guess the parent company Unilever, to stop selling their ice cream in the West Bank, and in particular, the legal blowback that is now being planned for that. So Lara, maybe we should just start by, you want to just briefly kind of lay out what exactly Ben & Jerry's Unilever has done, and what are some of the kind of lawfare, quote unquote, responses that the Israeli government and its supporters are talking about.
Sure, thanks, Peter. So what Ben & Jerry's did is announce this week, as you said, that they are no longer going to be selling in occupied territories, which is West Bank and East Jerusalem. I don't think they have an operation anywhere else. So this has immediately been framed by the Israeli government, by Israel's defenders abroad, as BDS, as a boycott of Israel, as anti-Israel, as anti-Semitic. The president of Israel called it a form of terrorism. So you get this just absolutely energetic blowback immediately. It's really, I think, important to emphasize the statement that was issued made clear this does not have anything to do with Israel. They're not ceasing, they're not ceasing to cut off distribution inside Israel. They say that explicitly. This is in that way very much similar to what happened with Airbnb in 2019, where you had a policy shift that targets the West Bank, targets settlements, being portrayed as if it's targeting all of Israel and framed as anti-Israel or anti-Jewish. So that's what they did. Immediately, alongside the howls of outrage, were threats saying this is going to bring them into all sorts of legal jeopardy. And first of all, I think we need to just make really clear, it is not illegal in the United States under federal law or in any state under state law. It is not illegal to boycott Israel or settlements. That would be impossible. You have the right to boycott what you want as individuals. That is protected free speech. What you have done, because it's not possible, I mean, if it were possible to outlaw it, I think probably people would have done that by now. What folks have done instead, and this is various groupings of what we call lawfare actors in the US working, I think I don't think it's a secret to say they're working with support or coordination with the government of Israel. And I say that based on a tweet from Bibi Netanyahu claiming credit for these laws at one point. Statements by Gilad Erdan, the current ambassador, former minister of strategic affairs, who said similar things. So you've got these laws that seek to impose consequences on people who boycott Israel or settlements. And in almost every case, it's either one. You've got a conflation of Israel and settlements. And there are two kinds of laws. One of those laws seeks to, in a sense, say, if you boycott Israel or settlements, you do not get to enjoy the privilege of having contracts with the state. And these are laws that have been challenged in multiple states, and they've been challenged as unconstitutional. And I think it is all but a very small number of advocates on this would say they are brazenly unconstitutional, because this is what's called an unconstitutional condition. It's basically saying that as a condition for competing for and winning a state contract, you must give up your free speech, and that is unconstitutional. Those have been litigated in court, and in each case, all but one, the courts have said very clearly, boy, this looks and smells unconstitutional. The the laws have continued to exist despite those findings by courts, because what legislatures have done repeatedly when they get that ruling, they say, okay, fine, we'll amend the law, not to cure the unconstitutionality, but to deprive the current set of plaintiffs of standing. So we'll narrow the way this law is applied to say, you know what, it doesn't apply to sole practitioners. It doesn't apply to a self-employed family of 3 running an operation. It only applies to bigger businesses and bigger contracts. So therefore, now that it no longer applies to these people, they aren't injured, so they no longer have standing, so the case is moot and the law stands. So that's one set of laws, and that's a set of laws that could be brought to bear against Unilever or Ben & Jerry's in theory, so that if they are bidding for a contract to provide ice cream to the State Fair of Texas, they can't sign the required certification about boycotting Israel or settlements, and therefore they would not be able to have that contract. That's one. Number 2 is pension funds. And you've got laws in a number of states, not all of the states that have the first kind of law have the second. The second kind of law states that states cannot invest pension funds in any companies that boycott Israel or settlements. And if they find they are invested in these companies, they have to divest. And this is, I think that's a harder question. I think it's harder to argue that's unconstitutional. I don't think there's a constitutional right to have state funds invested in your company. But that is another one that people are saying, well, can and will be brought to bear to punish Ben & Jerry's and Unilever.
That's really helpful. This is at the state level. Anything that's on the books or brewing at the federal level?
At the federal level, there have been efforts to legitimize the state laws, which are more sort of symbolic at this point. Those have failed. There were efforts to pass what was called the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, which was legislation really aimed at Europe and the UN to delegitimize differentiating between Israel and settlements. I think it's really important to say all of this legislation at the state level and at the federal level, if you look at the timeline of when this legislation started and gained steam, it really started right around the time that the European Union adopted its policy of differentiation, where they articulated in 2015, they affirmatively articulated a policy which said, under international law, you shouldn't be doing business in settlements. You should be distinguishing between Israel and settlements, and you shouldn't do business in settlements. And at that point, you saw a shift in the policy of Israel from fighting, BDS, the whole idea that boycotting Israel is the problem. You saw them sort of hijack the energies that saw BDS and boycotts of Israel as a problem, and turn it, 30 degrees. So now it's about really fighting boycotts of settlements, and that's really what all these laws are first and foremost about, because very few companies boycott Israel. Very few major companies in the world boycott Israel. What Israel is worried about is companies that reassert a green line that they have spent the past 53 years systematically trying to erase, both on the ground and in the hearts and minds of people in Israel and abroad. That's the biggest threat. So at the federal level, there is a legislation. There are those, last point. There are those who will talk about the Arab League boycott of Israel and say it is illegal to participate in a foreign-led boycott. The problem there is this. Ben & Jerry's not even boycotting, Ben & Jerry's choosing not to do business in the West Bank is a decision of Ben & Jerry's. To argue that anyone who chooses to not buy a West Bank product or not operate in settlements is automatically being directed by a foreign party, and therefore this is a foreign-led boycott, is absurd. Moreover, the foreign-led boycott argument is about coercive boycotts, right? It's basically saying US citizens will not be allowed, we will not allow them as a government to be turned into soldiers in someone else's war. So if you want to boycott on your own, that's a free speech issue. If you're boycotting because another country says you have to, as a condition for doing business with them, that's illegal. And that is simply not what's happening here. There is no coercive element. Even if you support the BDS movement, BDS is not twisting your arm and saying you have to do this. It's basically saying, like, an idea, if it comes from a foreign source, is somehow radioactive. It is absurd.
So how many, do you have a rough estimate of how many states have passed one or two of these kind of laws, either the law that says no contract, that you have to promise not to boycott in order to get a state contract, or that the state is not going to invest in any companies that are themselves not investing in Israel and in the settlements?
Yeah, I mean, so Palestine Legal tracks this closely. I track it closely. We both have tables. I think my latest count was 33 or 34 states have one or both kinds of laws. And I think it's also worth noting that not every law explicitly says that it applies to the West Bank. Most of the laws say, Israel, they define Israel to mean Israel, they define Israel to mean Israel and territories under Israel's control, or they define it to mean Israel and companies organized under the laws of the state of Israel. They have all sorts of ways to finesse it so it applies outside Israel's sovereign borders. But even for the ones that don't include that, the way it has been implemented, and we can see this based on the boycott, the blacklists that are actually behind this law, because any state that, I think every state that has this law, is part of the law is that they have to keep a blacklist of companies they're not allowed to work with. And those blacklists, the last time I looked, were full of companies that don't boycott Israel, but that don't work in settlements, particularly the European companies that do this based on international law.
And how bipartisan are these efforts? How much support are they getting from Democrats in state legislatures?
From what we've seen, it's entirely bipartisan. I mean, I think what can be said about these laws is in many cases they are not. They do not appear to be, they do not appear to come from state legislatures. I mean, you have outside parties coming. The fact that this is essentially template legislation that just keeps showing up over and over is indicative of the fact that this is a broader national campaign that may not have a whole lot of buy-in locally. But it doesn't have to have a lot of buy-in locally when all of the major legacy Jewish community organizations weigh in saying, this is the pro-Israel thing to do, this is the right thing to do, this is the thing you do to fight anti-Semitism. These are being passed and supported by Democrats as much as they are by Republicans. Right.
So do you have any sense of how much financial cost there could be to, I guess Unilever is the parent company, right? So it's not really Ben & Jerry's, it's Unilever, which sells all kinds of different stuff. How significant a cost they might face as a result of these laws?
It's a great question. I think the first thing to recognize is that the goal of this campaign right now of naming and shaming and targeting Ben & Jerry's and Unilever isn't so much about the financial cost of these laws. It's about reputational harm, and it's about legal misery and causing them trouble with shareholders and all of that. And a lot of that is about sending a message to all other companies: don't you dare go there. If you do this, you will also have misery. In terms of actual, the amount of money they could lose, I mean, first of all, it depends on what sort of contracts they have or would have competed for at state level. I think that's probably a fairly small, compared to the overall value of a company like Unilever, it's not going to be massive. And divestment, let's be clear, divestment is basically a performative exercise, right? It's the divesting body standing up and saying, we stand for these values. This is not consistent with our values. We are walking away, which is good. I mean, right? You make your statement, you feel good about yourself. But we've seen this with the fossil fuel industry, and you can sort of clear out your stock portfolio, but it doesn't necessarily or even likely have a real impact on the bottom line value of shares. And with something like Unilever, which again is a huge company, great value, broad-based companies inside of it, there's an entire world of investors that are not going to divest, and that if there is a brief drop in the price of shares, we'll probably say, wow, this is an opportunity to buy because this is a really good stock. And on top of that, you've got right now the potential for a reaction by people who support Ben & Jerry's for doing this, who might say, hey, this is the time to buy because I want to support them. So, this in and of itself is not going to bankrupt them, and it's not even necessarily from a shareholder perspective going to hurt their bottom line.
Right. Nor will the loss of contract with state governments. That's also not that significant.
It seems really unlikely. I mean, based on based on what I'm seeing from groups like FDD, which they published, the Foundation for Defense of Democracy has published something today. I think it's more likely that we're going to see other more creative efforts to actually draw blood. If you go back to the Airbnb case, I mean, Airbnb, losing state contracts doesn't really hurt Airbnb. Divestment wasn't an issue at that point. Airbnb, the major thing used against Airbnb was, first of all, a threat that this would screw up their IPO. They had an IPO that was about to happen. Mm-hmm. And then they had a bunch of slap suits in US courts. Mm-hmm. So you had, there's a case in a New York court with kind of a sort of an Israeli company on paper that had a footprint in New York, suing in a New York court for allegedly being deprived the opportunity to do business via Airbnb and settlements because of illegal anti-Semitic discrimination. I think that's a harder kind of slap suit to launch when it comes to ice cream. I don't think you can say I'm a New Yorker living in a settlement and I'm being deprived of my right to have ice cream because I'm Jewish. But particularly as was the case with Airbnb, when if you just cross back the green line, you'd have the right, not a problem. It's just where you're located, not because you're Jewish. But we're hearing murmurings that suggest to me that there's going to be an effort to rally shareholders, to raise something maybe in the next shareholder meeting. There was something I saw like looking to file a complaint with the SEC. I'm a little baffled what those complaints look like, right? Again, you have, from the conservative free speech perspective, absolute defense of, on principle, a company or a person's right to not provide services based on principle. But it seems to be this is the one area where there is no such right. I'm just not sure how you weaponize that with lawsuits, but we will see.
So I wonder if you've seen anything that helps explain why this actually came to pass, why Ben & Jerry's and Unilever did this. I mean, as you say, it's not, as I understand it, it's pretty unusual for American companies, even for global companies to do this. Airbnb had a rough time of it and ended up retreating. So what's your theory about why they stepped into the fire on this?
It's a great question. I mean, informed speculation. This is a company that the Ben & Jerry's brand is leveraged on its social justice work, right? That is their identity. And their presence in settlements, the fact that you had an Israeli franchisee who is operating in settlements has been a point of, I think, frustration and target for activism, including from Vermont, where it originated, for a long time. I don't know what the tipping point was. I don't know why they decided to do it now. But they are, if you were going to pick a company to really push to take a stand, it makes sense that it would be a company that defines itself by its social activism, right? I have to hope that they studied carefully the Airbnb precedents and knew what they were getting into and are prepared to stand up to it. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's, I think, special about this case is, Ben & Jerry's is owned by Unilever, but as we were all learning, I knew nothing about this a week ago. Yeah. Ben & Jerry's, when they were acquired by Unilever, retained the autonomy to make decisions like this, decisions that are their social justice work, which puts them in a really interesting place as part of a large company that will then be responsible for what they do. I guess the big question will be going forward, does Unilever stand behind it? And right now, I mean, just minutes ago on Twitter, I saw something from like one of the senior people at Unilever, saying he's making clear that they're not backing away from their business in Israel. And people suggesting that that's almost a rebuke to Ben & Jerry's. But the Ben & Jerry's statement doesn't say they're walking away from Israel, right? It says they're walking away from distributing in settlements. So I don't see that necessarily being a rebuke as much as a clarification that this is about the location across the green line and not about Israel itself.
Right. And also, it sounds like from what you're saying, Unilever doesn't have any, unless they want to sell the Ben & Jerry's brand, they don't have any choice, but they have to go along with this because Ben & Jerry's has the right to make this decision, whether Unilever likes it a lot or not.
I don't know. That's above my level of expertise in terms of how that corporation works.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me about the response to this is obviously people on the kind of right have been very angry, saying it's anti-Semitic, et cetera. I've been struck by the general kind of, praise and excitement on the left, which in some ways I find somewhat interesting and even ironic, because as someone who had suggested a settlement boycott myself, I'm very well aware that the folks in the BDS movement are generally take a very quite skeptical view in general of the notion of distinguishing between settlements and Israel proper, right? And so kind of the they make reasonable arguments like that ultimately these policies are being directed by the Israeli government. This, which is, settlements didn't just emerge, by themselves. They're extensions of Israeli government policy. So I'm curious if that's been your perception as well, and why you think it is that there's been so much enthusiasm about a settlement boycott, given that, as you're suggesting, it can be read actually as an implicit as a distinction between a legitimate Israel inside the Green Line and an illegitimate Israel beyond the Green Line, which many people in the BDS movement reject.
Yeah, no, I think you make a fair point. I've seen Palestinians reacting to it both ways. Mm-hmm. And look, my sense looking at a lot of the reactions, certainly on social media, is, fine, this isn't perfect. We'd rather they were boycotting everything, but the spectacle of watching Israel being prepared to basically declare war on the United States, on a company named after its two Jewish founders, for the sake of effectively admitting to the world that is not interested in a two-state solution, and that it's insisting that the world recognize greater Israel, or be called anti-Israel, anti-Semitic. I've got to imagine for folks who are advocates of BDS against Israel, this just makes their point. The Israeli government doesn't distinguish between Israel and settlements. Right. It could not be making that point any more clearly when Herzog is the guy getting up and saying it is economic terrorism to cease distributing ice cream in the West Bank. Okay, let's stop pretending that this Israeli government, or maybe any Israeli government, has any interest at all in a two-state solution. Okay, now we said that, so can we agree that it's not anti-Semitic to talk about all of Israel when we're protesting? I think that's the framing. And look, the other thing that this lays bare, and I know you know this, but it is worth saying, there is a constant sort of refrain in the Jewish community in the US on this question of anti-Semitism. As we're seeing more and more, you've got to fight anti-Semitism, surging, blah, 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 all of which is true. The refrain says it is anti-Semitic ipso facto to conflate Jews and Israel, which is why if people decide, they say, if you decide to protest for Palestinian rights and you do it in front of a synagogue, you're an anti-Semite. Regardless of whether, I guess, they're flying an Israeli flag. The idea being that if you don't see a distinction between Jews and you hold all Jews responsible for the acts of Israel, you're an anti-Semite. But this is what we're seeing with the Ben and Jerry's is basically that this is a do as we say, not as we do. Mm-hmm. Because what we're saying when people are defending, Israel and saying it is anti-Semitic for Ben and Jerry's to get out of the West Bank, what you're saying is all Jews are equivalent to settlers. You cannot make a distinction. They're basically saying if you are refusing to serve settlers, then you're refusing to serve all Jews, which erases all the Jews who aren't settlers, by the way, which is kind of offensive. Mm. But it is exactly that same conflation, but embracing it and celebrating it and effectively trying to make it the law of the land.
Right. So the last question I want to ask you is just to go back to these laws. You have written about the potential that these laws about state contracts, about state pension funds, that the Israel-Palestine question could be a kind of canary in the coal mine, and that these could be expanded beyond just Israel-Palestine. Are there other examples that you can point to of where that's happening, and talk about the larger concern that you have there?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a piece in 2018 arguing that progressives who are getting on board with these anti-boycott laws for Israel were giving a progressive kosher stamp for legislation that will be a template. It will be a model and a template for legislation that quashes free speech on any issue you pick. I actually went through the exercise of seeing how many words I would have to change to make that possible. And I think at the time people saw that as alarmist, like until it happens, it could never happen. In 2021, we've seen it happen. We saw it start. So as of June, if you are in Texas, you no longer, you can no longer have state contracts in the state of Texas if you are a company that boycotts the fossil fuel industry, the oil and gas industry, and you can no longer have state contracts if you discriminate against the gun and ammunition industry, which I'm pretty sure would include the NRA by their definition. So, if you are, a company which has a principled policy of not investing in you on your policy, in whatever if you have some kind of ethics statement and you say we don't invest or work with the gun industry, that's it. Don't come to Texas. Oklahoma, Ohio, I think Oklahoma passed a similar piece of legislation on oil and gas. I actually posted a table online yesterday about this. So it's only 2 states have passed them so far. I think they were pending in 4 more states. And that's the tip of the iceberg. It really is. I mean, it's not a matter of being paranoid. You only have to change a few words. And then the logic behind them is exactly the same. It's saying you can boycott what you want. We're not telling you what you can and can't do. You have your free speech. But if you're going to do it, you don't have a right to get taxpayer money. We don't have to let you earn taxpayer money. And that goes back to unconstitutional conditions, right? And you can imagine a state which ends up saying, well, we will not give state contracts to any company that has any relations with Planned Parenthood or with the ACLU. It's easy enough. And the state says, listen, this is the will of our people. The voters put into office legislators who believe that the ACLU is evil. Therefore, we've legislated this. It's our right. Unconstitutional conditions. If you don't protect free speech, even free speech you find distasteful or uncomfortable, then you're paving the way for quashing free speech on everything. And we're starting to see that here. And by the way, when I say it's a template, it's like copy paste, right? It's not just saying it's a similar thing. It's like copy paste.
Yeah. No, this is really important. I mean, I think you're laying out a powerful case for why making a kind of Israel-Palestine exception to general progressive and free speech principles is bad, not only for Palestinian rights, but actually is bad for the progressive agenda more generally, because the two cannot be entirely cordoned off from one another.
Look, I'll also say, if you are a conservative, I mean, do you want a state that has a extremely progressive legislature, legislating you can't have contracts if you fill in the blank conservative agenda item? Again, you've got to protect free speech, even the speech you find distasteful or objective. I mean, objectionable. So.
Yeah. Well, this was terrific. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lara, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in to this episode of the Occupied Thoughts podcast, a project of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. You can visit our website at fmep.org to subscribe to our many resources and find today's podcast episode posted. You can also subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. I'm Peter Beinart. I look forward to our next episode.